The 15th of April, 1945, southwest of Bergen, Nazi Germany. The British 11th Armoured Division liberates Bergen-Belsen, one of the worst Nazi concentration camps, which would epitomize the true bestiality and horrors of the Nazi regime and its death camps. The British forces find 13,000 unburied dead bodies and almost 60,000 prisoners who are sick and starved. More than 13,000 former prisoners, too ill to recover, will die of various diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis during the months following the camp's liberation. The British forces capture male and female Nazi personnel responsible for these horrors and force them to help bury the dead bodies in mass graves. One of them is the camp commandant, Josef Kramer. Josef Kramer, an only child in a middle-class family, was born on the 10th of November 1906 in Munich, then part of the German Empire. His parents, Theodor and Maria Kramer, brought him up as a strict Roman Catholic, and in 1915, the family moved from Munich to Augsburg, where Josef completed elementary school. In 1920, he began an apprenticeship as an electrician, but from 1925 to 1933, except for working in a department store and as an accountant, he was mostly unemployed. During this time, Kramer still lived in his parents' house, and when his father also lost his job during the Great Depression, the whole family fell into economic hardship. It was Germany's economic collapse during the Great Depression, beginning in 1929, that most contributed to the Nazi Party's success. The crisis resulted in widespread unemployment and poverty, and also led to an increase in crime. The resulting anger and fear left the Germans vulnerable to arguments from both the extreme right and left. One such German was Josef Kramer, who joined the Nazi Party in December 1931 and the SS in June 1932. While the Great Depression and German economic conditions were not solely responsible for bringing Hitler to power, they helped to create an environment in which he gained support, and on the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by the German President Paul von Hindenburg. Immediately after Hitler came to power, Germany became a dictatorship, and the Nazi regime quickly began to restrict the civil and human rights of the Jews and established the first concentration camps, imprisoning its political opponents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others classified as dangerous. Unlike prisons, with which they are often inaccurately compared today, concentration camps were independent of any judicial review. The first such camp, Dachau, was established in March 1933, less than 2 months after Hitler became the Chancellor. While most Germans disapproved of anti-Jewish violence, dislike of Jews, easily stirred up in hard times, extended far beyond the Nazi Party faithful. The majority of Germans, at least passively, accepted discrimination against Jews. During periods preceding new measures against the Jews, propaganda campaigns created an atmosphere tolerant of violence against them. Propaganda that demonized Jews also served to prepare the German population in the context of national emergency for harsher measures such as mass deportations and eventually genocide, in which Josef Kramer played an important role. Kramer's career in concentration camps began in 1934 when he was assigned as a guard at Dachau. He was requested there by Hans Loritz, whose initial task in the camp was to oversee junior SS volunteers such as Kramer, who for the first time, at the age of 25, moved out of the parental home. Established in March 1933, Dachau was the first regular concentration camp built by the Nazi government. In October 1933, Dachau's commandant, Theodor Eicke, introduced a system of regulations which inflicted brutal punishments on prisoners for the slightest offenses. In the camp, Eicke was known as Papa Eicke, and his guards as Papa Eicke's boys, and under the slogan, "Tolerance means weakness," he advised his men that any SS man with a soft heart should retire at once to a monastery. Eicke ensured that the Dachau camp served as a model for all later concentration camps. It also became a training center for SS guards who were deployed throughout the concentration camp system. In July 1934, Loritz was given command of Esterwergen concentration camp. Josef Kramer followed him in November 1934, and until June 1936, Kramer worked as a clerk in the commandant's office of the Esterwergen concentration camp under Camp Commandant Loritz. As a commandant of Westerwegen, Loritz made camp rules stricter, interrogated prisoners, and ordered torture. After the close of Westerwegen, Loritz returned to Dachau as camp commandant in 1936. Kramer returned to Dachau with him and was assigned to clerical duties in the command center. From June 1934 to August 1938, Kramer was employed in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, first in the adjutant's office, and then rose to the position of head of the post office. In the spring of 1938, Adolf Hitler annexed the federal state of Austria into the German Reich. The Anschluss, as it became known, took place over 3 days between the 11th and 13th of March 1938. Several months later, the Nazis began to operate Mauthausen concentration camp near Linz. The conditions of the camp were even more severe than most other Nazi concentration camps, and half of the 190,000 inmates died at Mauthausen or its subcamps between 1938 and 1945. Kramer was transferred to the Mauthausen concentration camp in August 1938 and became adjutant to the camp commandant Franz Zerreis. The Second World War began on the 1st of September 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The last operational Polish unit surrendered on the 6th of October. The German occupation of Poland was exceptionally brutal. The Nazis considered Poles to be racially inferior, and they launched a campaign of terror intended to destroy the Polish nation and culture, and to reduce the Poles to a leaderless population of peasants and workers laboring for German masters. In May 1940, around 60 kilometers west of Krakow, the Germans established Auschwitz concentration camp. The direct reason for the establishment of the camp was the fact that the mass arrest of Poles were increasing beyond the capacity of existing local prisons. From May to November 1940, Kramer was adjutant to Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Haas, and then completed training as Schutzhaftlagerführer, the camp director in the Dachau concentration camp, until April 1941, when he was appointed commandant of Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp. Natzweiler-Struthof was the only concentration camp established by the Germans in the territory of pre-war France, about 31 miles southwest of Strasbourg. Prisoners worked in the nearby granite quarries, in construction projects, and in the maintenance of the camp. There were about 50 subcamps in the Natzweiler-Struthof camp system, and by the fall of 1944, there were about 7,000 prisoners in the main camp, and more than 20,000 in the subcamps. About 52,000 prisoners were estimated to be held there during its time of operation. It was a labor camp, a transit camp, and as the war went on, a place of execution. Some died from the exertions of their labor and malnutrition. There were an estimated 22,000 deaths at the camp, including its network of subcamps. As commandant of Natzweiler-Struthof, Kramer personally carried out the gassings of 86 Jewish men and women, part of a group of 87 selected at Auschwitz to become anatomical specimens in a proposed Jewish skull collection, to be housed at the Anatomy Institute at the Reich University of Strasbourg. The purpose of this project was to prove the alleged racial inferiority of the so-called Jewish race, and to emphasize that Jews were subhumans and the Germans were superhumans. The 87 inmates were transported to Natzweiler-Struthof from Auschwitz, and 46 of these individuals were originally from Thessaloniki in Greece. One male victim was shot as he fought to keep from being gassed, and 86 prisoners, 57 men and 29 women, were gassed at the end of August 1943 in a gas chamber built under Kramer's command. Kramer himself directed this murder operation and watched the victims' death throes through a window. However, the project of the so-called Jewish skeleton collection was never completed, and when the Allies discovered the corpses, they were preserved in formalin, and some of them were beheaded. After the war, Kramer admitted he had forced the Jewish victims into the gas chamber and gassed them on the orders of Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler. He added that he could not disobey such orders, and that he did not consider killing these people a crime. In May 1944, Kramer was brought back to Auschwitz to manage the extermination of Hungarian Jews. The commandant of the whole Auschwitz concentration and extermination camp complex was Rudolf Haas, and Josef Kramer became the commandant of Birkenau, which was the largest of more than 40 camps and subcamps which made up the Auschwitz complex. Birkenau was divided into 10 sections, separated by electrified barbed wire fences, and was patrolled by SS guards, including after 1942, SS dog handlers. During its 3 years of operation, it had a range of functions. When construction began in October 1941, it was supposed to be a camp for 125,000 prisoners of war. It opened as a branch of Auschwitz in March 1942 and served at the same time as a center for the extermination of Jews. In its final phase, from 1944, it also became a place where prisoners were concentrated before being transferred to labor in German industry in the depths of the Third Reich. In mid-May 1944, the Hungarian authorities, in coordination with the German security police, began to systematically deport Hungarian Jews. SS Colonel Adolf Eichmann was chief of the team of deportation experts that worked with the Hungarian authorities. The Hungarian police carried out the roundups and forced the Jews onto the deportation trains. In less than 2 months, from the 15th of May to the 9th of July 1944, nearly 440,000 Jews were deported from Hungary in more than 145 trains. Most were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where upon arrival and after selection on a rail ramp, about 80% of the deportees were gassed on arrival. Because the crematoria were unable to cope with the number of corpses, firing pits were dug, where the bodies were burned. In light of the worsening military situation, and facing threats from Allied leaders of war crimes trials, Hungarian Regent Miklos Horthy ordered a halt to the deportations on the 7th of July 1944, and by the time they had stopped 2 days later, almost the entire community of Jews in the Hungarian countryside had died. At Auschwitz, the process of selection and murder was carefully planned and organized. When a train stopped at the platform, the arrivals were lined up into 2 columns, men and boys in one, women and girls in the other. The SS physicians, such as Josef Mengele, performed a selection. The only criterion was the appearance of the prisoners, whose fate, for labor or for death, was determined at will. The SS personnel, when supervising the loading of prisoners, who were to be transported in cars to the gas chambers, often behaved inhumanely and tortured the incoming prisoners in a cruel way, beating the women, the men, and the children with a stick or with a cane while forcing them into the cars. There were a number of witnesses who said that Kramer took an active part in the selection parades. He loaded people into the trucks, and when they resisted, he would beat them. The SS men kept the people fated to die, unaware of what awaited them. They were told that they were being sent to the camp where work was waiting for them, but first they had to undergo disinfection and bathe. They were then told politely to hang their clothing on hooks, take a shower, and were even promised that they would be provided with soup and tea or coffee. However, they were taken into the gas chambers, and after the doors were shut, SS men dropped Zyklon B pellets through vents in the roof or holes in the side of the chamber. The victims were dead within 20 minutes. Johann Kramer, an SS doctor who oversaw the gassings, testified that the shouting and screaming of the victims could be heard through the opening, and it was clear that they fought for their lives. After the victims were murdered, their gold teeth were extracted, and the women's hair was shorn by the Sonderkommando, which were groups of Jews forced to work in the crematorium. The bodies were hauled to the crematorium furnaces for incineration, the bones were pulverized, and the ashes were scattered in the fields. At Auschwitz, Kramer soon became known among his subordinates as a harsh taskmaster. After the war, one prisoner named Sompolinski testified how on one occasion, Josef Kramer had been shooting at him and a bullet went through his hand. Another prisoner, Glinowiecki, testified that Kramer had given him a beating of 25 strokes. Some of Kramer's specialties were to shoot at people with a machine gun and set dogs on them. Auschwitz survivor Olga Leniel witnessed how Kramer, during a selection in the infirmary of the women's camp, crushed the skull of a female prisoner with a club blow. On the 1st of December 1944, Kramer became the commandant of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. At the end of July 1944, there were around 7,300 prisoners interned in the Bergen-Belsen camp complex. At the beginning of December 1944, this number had increased to around 15,000, and in February 1945, the number of prisoners was 22,000. As prisoners evacuated from the east continued to arrive, the camp population soared to over 60,000 by the 15th of April, 1945. The prisoners got almost no food during these death marches, and there was no food when they arrived at the camp either. The camp was so overcrowded that the prisoners had to sleep in a sitting position on the floor. Sanitation was incredibly inadequate, with few latrines and water faucets for the tens of thousands of prisoners interned in Bergen-Belsen at this time. Overcrowding, poor sanitary conditions, and the lack of adequate food, water, and shelter led to an outbreak of diseases such as typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and dysentery, causing an ever-increasing number of deaths. In the first few months of 1945, tens of thousands of prisoners died. Those who survived described the conditions in the camp as hell on earth. During the winter months, when it was freezing cold, there were only 200 blankets in the whole camp for tens of thousands of prisoners. In March 1945, due to starvation, thirst, and the outbreak of typhus epidemics, the average daily mortality rate of the prisoners was between 250 and 300. At Bergen-Belsen, Kramer's rule was so brutal that he became known as the Beast of Belsen. Morning roll calls were introduced and even the sick prisoners had to attend them. After the war, Kramer explained it by saying that these prisoners were too lazy to leave their barracks, and thanks to attending the roll calls that lasted hours, the inmates for a while could leave the very bad air in their huts. Herta Ehrlet, one of Bergen-Belsen's guards, recalled that when one Russian female inmate tried to escape and was caught, Josef Kramer started to box her ears, and then he was kicking and shaking her, and later hitting her with a stick on her head and face and all over her body. As a result, the girl gave the names of two other girls who she said had helped her. When these two girls refused to confess, Kramer gave instructions for them to receive 5 strokes on the bare behind to make them confess. After the war, he only admitted to having slapped the face of the girl who wanted to escape, and claimed that he did not know anything about the other 2 girls. Josef Kramer also took part in one of the favorite sporting activities of the SS at Bergen-Belsen, which was shooting at starving prisoners who were going near the kitchen. Before liberation, there were thousands of thirsty prisoners in the camp, even though Bergen-Belsen was only 400 meters away from a river. The little water the SS gave prisoners was taken out of concrete tanks in which filth was found. After the war, when Kramer was asked why he had not pumped water from the river, he claimed that it was not fit for drinking and he lacked the necessary materials to pump it. However, this was not true, as the water from the river was fit for drinking, and after the liberation, the British troops pumped it with material they found in the camp. When Kramer realized that the end of the war was inevitable and the Allies were approaching, he turned around completely. Roll calls were stopped, the inmates were left to their own devices, and he even tried to find food for hungry and typhoid-ridden prisoners. Because of this, he expected not to be arrested after the war was over. However, he was wrong. When the British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April, 1945, Josef Kramer remained in the camp and did not flee as many of the other camp's guards had done. He took the British on a tour of the camp to inspect the scenes. Corpses rotted everywhere. Rats attacked the living, too weak to fight them off. Piles of corpses lay all over the camp. Mass graves were filled in, and the huts were filled with prisoners in every stage of emaciation and disease. Holocaust survivor Dieter Kraus, who was among the prisoners liberated at Bergen-Belsen, described seeing a group of women squatting around a pot in which they cooked a human liver. Afterward, a British officer pointed his pistol at Kramer and forced him to carry to the military hospital an injured prisoner who had been shot at while trying to enter the prisoner's kitchen and the potato cellar. 2 days after liberation, on the 17th of April 1945, Kramer was arrested and led through the camp in shackles. During interrogations, he admitted to carrying out the gassing of 86 Jews in the Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp, which, as he said, he had done as a recipient of orders without feeling anything. After evacuating Bergen-Belsen, British forces burned down the whole camp to prevent the spread of typhus. During its existence, approximately 50,000 persons died at Bergen-Belsen, and more than 13,000 former prisoners, too ill to recover, died after liberation. Justice finally caught up with Kramer when he was tried at the Belsen Trial, which began on the 17th of September, 1945. At the beginning of the trial, he pleaded not guilty, as did all the other defendants. He also said that the allegations referring to Auschwitz gas chambers, mass executions, whipping and cruelty were untrue. Later, he changed his statement and claimed only to have been present during selections for the gas chamber, but never taking active part in them. However, Auschwitz survivor Anita Lasker testified that Kramer had taken part in selections at Auschwitz. Kramer further claimed that if any SS personnel who found pleasure in torturing the poor inmates carried sticks or unauthorized weapons, they did it against his orders. Kramer was also asked about Irma Gräser, allegedly his former lover who became known as the hyena of Auschwitz. She used to kick prisoners with her heavy boots or whip them with her woven leather whip, which was covered with cellophane so that human blood could be easily washed from it. Kramer said that he could only say the very best about Gräser and added that she took her duties very seriously. The earlier mentioned Herta Ehrlich, one of the Bergen-Belsen guards who was sentenced to 15 years in prison, testified that on one occasion when she had complained of the increasing death rate to Kramer, he replied, "Let them die. Why should you care?" The only person to testify on Kramer's behalf was his wife Rosina, to whom he had been married since October 1937, and they had 3 children. On the 17th of November 1945, Kramer was sentenced to death by hanging. However, on the 18th of November, he submitted a petition for clemency to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. In it, he blamed the catastrophic conditions in Bergen-Belsen on his superiors, referred to the war-related circumstances, and described himself as a recipient of orders who had sacrificially fulfilled his duty without consideration. Kramer claimed that he had not fled cowardly before the handover of the camp, but had remained conscientiously on the spot out of concern for the prisoners entrusted to him, and concluded as follows: "I am completely innocent of the crimes charged against me for Bergen-Belsen, as well as at Auschwitz. I am not a war criminal. I did not kill any human being on my own initiative, and I was only a soldier and as such carried out the orders of my military superiors." His lies, however, did not help him escape justice, and the request for clemency was not granted. Kramer was 39 years old when the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint carried out the sentence on the 13th of December 1945. There were no tears shed for Josef Kramer. Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.